Okay, I think we can go ahead. Welcome. I'm Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action. And we're here tonight for a webinar with Subrata Ghoshroy on missile defense. Missile defense has been a longstanding component of the arms control discussion and the nuclear disarmament discussion, but it has gotten relatively little attention lately. But that's unjustified because missile defense is actually a key issue between the US, Russia, and China. So our purpose tonight is to shine a spotlight on the whole question of missile defense and get the benefit of Subrata Ghoshroy's expertise in explaining the situation. Subrata Ghoshroy will discuss the recommendations of the recently released report of the International Working Group called Moving Beyond Missile Defense and Space Weapons, which was sponsored jointly by the International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility, or INES, and the Abolition 2000 Network. And Subrata was the editor of their report. Subrata Ghoshroy is a research affiliate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's program in Science, Technology, and Society, and a specially appointed professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. For 20 years, he was a senior engineer in the field of high energy lasers. Later, he was a professional staff member of the House Armed Services Committee and a senior analyst at the Government Accountability Office. He is the first and so far the only whistleblower in the history of the GAO. He is the co-chair of INES and has been a member of MAPPA for many years. Subrata, take it away.
Thank you very much, Cole, for this introduction. And if I could have the second slide, which says highlights. In this, I just want to talk about or lay out today's agenda. So I briefly mentioned actually the INES report. And then it's two principal recommendations, and then I will start my talk. It's going to be for about, I'd say 15-20 minutes I will talk. If I go too much above, Cole, just please remind me. Because there's so much to talk about in this issue. But I want to give a lot of time for people to really participate, and we can flesh out some of these things, of course, during the Q&A. So after the history, I talk about spending on the missile defense, which is a big issue for all these years, and then basically throw out some ideas as to why we should urgently renew our focus on missile defense and renew our opposition, actually, is what my argument is. And there are several highlights in that, in my argument about that. And that is there continues to be huge technology roadblocks, as Cole mentioned. I was the first whistleblower in the history of the General Accounting Office, which is now called the Government Accountability Office. It's just actually celebrating its 100th year this year, and my whistleblowing happened in 2006, so 16 years ago. And to talk about the enormous waste and fraud, and focus on the dangers caused by the missile defense program to global stability, and now this flashpoint with Russia. Although I must caveat that missile defense is always in the background with the friction with Russia, but of course this current flashpoint has more to do with NATO expansion and then the Russian buildup within its own borders. So next slide, please. Okay, so here is the history of in a nutshell of this, or rather historical milestones. So in missile defense program got going right away after the Sputnik event when the Soviet Union launched its first ever Earth orbiting satellite. So it required a capacity to launch that satellite, and that's same as a missile like an ICBM. So the people in Washington and Moscow as well immediately realized the threat from missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and implicit in that, of course, they're carrying nuclear weapons. By the 1960s, of course, Soviet Union has mastered both the fission bomb and the fusion bomb, and of course, the American arsenal was growing very, very fast. So 60s was marked by the immediate attempt to build missile defense systems. So a Moscow ABM system was built, and apparently I actually didn't see it when I was there, but it's still there. It's obviously it's not a functional system, and the U.S. system, which was put in place in Grand Forks in North Dakota, was dismantled the day after it became operational, after spending about $2 billion in those dollars back in 1962 to start a missile defense system, and it was torn down and it's gone. So missile defense kind of disappeared after these technical issues were realized that it's impossible to really defend nationally, globally, well, let alone globally, nationally, large areas with missiles, because it was realized very quickly that defense brings offense, and the offensive side will find ways to get through. So this madness of arms race resulting from the atmospheric tests in the 60s and stuff of nuclear weapons. So in the 70s, there was this realization, and of all people, President Richard Nixon of the United States and Brezhnev in Soviet Union, Soviet president, they signed this famous anti-ballistic missile treaty, ABM treaty, which came into force in 1972. And it really is a landmark treaty that held world peace, nuclear stability for 30 years until President Bush withdrew in 2002. But I'll come back to that. So 60s, the major milestone in the 70s was the ABM treaty. And in the 80s, we, of course, some of you were old enough to know about the Star Wars program, and others like me were very familiar with what Ronald Reagan embarked on in the early 80s, actually in 1983 in a speech. He launched this Strategic Defense Initiative Program, SDIO, and created the organization as the SDI, and the organization, O for organization, and started talking about the Soviet threat in a much more aggressive way, and the evil empire and sort of things like that. And he started this Star Wars program, which was a massive, massive missile defense program that would have defense systems in on the ground and sea, in space, and just missile defense and space weapons, people, their dream come true. And the defense budget, of course, went up dramatically. Then this was followed by a scale back after the end of the Cold War in 1991. And well, the program started falling apart. I was part of that program for all those years, from 1983 to 1984 to 1994. By that time, the program had really gotten scaled back. Lots of waste, nothing. It was so much science fiction than science. And so it was scaled back by President Bush, 41, George Bush's father. And it didn't cancel the program because there was just the political situation wasn't quite correct, and so he kept it alive but scaled it back. And President Clinton in the 90s then really, and I was in on Capitol Hill just in that time, as Clinton began his second term, 95, 96, 97, 98, those years I was in Washington working directly on congressional staff, first in the House International Relations Committee and then House Armed Services Committee. And I was intimately familiar with debates about missile defense that the Republicans started pushing with their contract with America, and the missile defense became a part of that by Newt Gingrich, who was the Republican Speaker of the House. And President Clinton was initially mildly opposing these efforts, and he certainly didn't want to abandon the ABM treaty, but there was a lot of pressure on President Clinton to do that from the Republican side, and he was having his own personal problems, of course, that all of us know about, and ultimately he caved, and he cut a deal with Republican Senate leader Trent Lott, and that Trent Lott will get some missile defense, and President Clinton agreed to deploy a missile defense, saying only caveat was that it should be technically feasible. But later on, it didn't mean anything. Missile defenses were being deployed, currently deployed, that are not technically feasible. And but significantly, Clinton's agreement with the Republicans then paved the way for the withdrawal from the ABM treaty, because Clinton was trying to amend the treaty. He was trying to amend the treaty in some ways that would allow the missile defense research program to continue, because ABM's treaty was a fantastic treaty. It really limited R&D and deployment, of course, but R&D as well, research and development on specific items. And one of the things that not many people know or pay attention to is the ABM treaty's contribution towards controlling space weapons, because it didn't allow even research on space-based sensors. So now it's, of course, Wild West in space. And but Clinton's decision to cut the deal with the Republicans, and then later, of course, the withdrawal of the ABM treaty by George Bush as soon as he became president, it started the fading away of the opposition, the traditional Democratic and arms controlling communities, which also contained Republicans' opposition to missile defense. So we see the situation where we are now. And immediately after the withdrawal from the ABM treaty, the program on space, missile defense just took off, with doubling of the funding and also starting some space weapons research. So next slide, please. So what is the missile defense system? Quickly, currently we're talking about in the 60s and 70s, when we talked about missile defense, we were really talking about a so-called strategic program, and meaning it was to intercept ICBMs from the Soviet Union. That was the main thing, and no other missile defense was really talked about. So the current missile defense program is somewhat different from that, and it evolved especially after the Gulf War in 1991. And so now we have several components. First is a ground-based mid-course, which is the old program, meaning these are interceptor missiles, not nuclear tipped anymore. They're non-nuclear interceptor missiles in silos that obviously look like ICBMs themselves. And they are located in Fort Greely in Alaska, and then in Vandenberg Air Force in that Air Force Base in California. And it is described by the Pentagon as a system not to counter Russian or Chinese missiles. That was the old system. Now it's only to counter the so-called rogue states. And it used to be, of course, Iraq, Iran, Libya, North Korea, you name it. And now, of course, many of those countries, nations, we have destroyed. And the remaining ones are Iran and North Korea. And for them, we are doing this rogue state ICBM interceptors called the ground-based interceptor located. Then I will come back to that later. And the other component is, this is the most aggressive part of the system now. It's sea-based, it's on Aegis destroyers, and they carry a missile called Standard Missile, and it is deployed globally, all around Russia. So, and also in the Pacific, near Japan and China, of course. And they have also now created another version of the Aegis-based system. It's not on the ship, it's on Aegis land-based. It's called the Aegis Ashore, and this is being pushed in Europe, in the around Russia, in the countries like Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, and so forth, and the NATO countries, and in the Asia Pacific, in Japan, in Korea. Although Korea doesn't have an Aegis system yet, but Japan does. And they're trying to put one on Guam, but the Guam system not quite clear yet. And the land-based THAAD, which is Theater High Altitude Area Defense System, and that's a regional air defense system, missile defense system, and it's deployed in South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Guam, etc. And then finally, so the different parts are, so you have the strategic one, which is ICBMs, and then you come to the intermediate medium range missiles with Aegis and THAAD. And then finally, what they call the terminal phase of the system, which is when the missiles, if they are intercontinental, they have, or medium range missiles, they have actually left the atmosphere for some part of their journey and then re-entered the atmosphere. And after this re-entry, this is what's called the terminal phase. And for that, there is the land-based former air defense system, Patriot. Now it's called Patriot Advanced Capability, with the faster interceptor and so forth, and for intercepting shorter range missiles. And they are heavily deployed in the Middle East. It's deployed in as many as 14 countries, including Japan, Turkey, and UAE. Next slide, please. Okay. So I've been talking about that a little bit before this slide, is the changing character of the missile defense. And the thing I want to point out that how it evolved from the original GMD type system, which was nuclear tipped missiles to stop ICBMs from Soviet Union, to now assumed to be nuclear tipped from Iran. Doesn't have a nuclear weapon. This country is and North Korea, which has potentially a nuclear capability, of course, has some nuclear weapons. And anyway, I will make the point that for this threat, which is the so-called the rogue threat, these countries, even if they have a nuclear weapon like North Korea, they have to be completely suicidal to launch their arsenal of however many that you can count on your own fingers, that to launch a nuclear missile, attack a country like the United States, and then get completely obliterated in response. So it's absolutely a hyped, bogus threat that keeps this military-industrial complex, nuclear military-industrial complex going, making lots of money. And But after the Gulf War, this change happened, and that was the first time in 1991. Of course, there was this occasion when Saddam Hussein launched a Scud missile, which was an old Russian missile, a type missile, and of one of the missiles landed on U.S. soldiers' barracks in Saudi Arabia and killed up to 40 soldiers. That was the biggest casualty of U.S. soldiers in the in the Gulf War, in the invasion of Saddam in Kuwait. And but the clamor for missile defense started right away, and 1991, and President Clinton is elected in 90. He comes to office in 92 and starts facing this demand now. And in 94, the Republicans take over, and the demand changes. It becomes part of the Republican contract with America, and Gingrich makes it a point that we have to have. So when I was on the Hill in 95 and 96, on the committee, we just have hearings after hearings on missile defense with all the people who originally were in the Star Wars program come and testify why we need missile defense. So now it's not really discussed that it's non-nuclear. These missiles that we are trying to defend against, it's really debatable whether one needs a missile defense system to stop these short-range missiles. Because I'll just give you one example. The Israeli Iron Dome program, the interceptor costs $100,000. One Iron Dome interceptor costs $100,000. And they launch, I believe, 2 to 3 interceptors per intercept. So you're talking about spending $200,000, $300,000. And this is to stop a short-range Hamas rocket that cost between $500 and $1,000. So it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There are other ways to defeat this kind of people. Didn't have artillery barrages to hit an artillery shell with an artillery shell. You basically take out the launch pads where the shells were coming from, and not trying to hit the. And you can imagine, even the Hamas rocket is not very fast, but it's still faster than the artillery shells. And so you have to launch all these interceptors and then and show this tremendous success in intercepting something like that at this kind of a cost differential. And the politics is such, and that's another point I want to make later about the Israeli participation in the U.S. missile defense program, which gives it a lot of heft as far as Congress is concerned. Okay, next slide, please.
Subrata, you asked for a time check. You've been
Yes.
going for 20 minutes.
Oh, geez. Okay.
You should keep going.
Oh,
It's good,
okay.
Good
okay.
info.
Okay. Yeah, I knew I was going to happen. I'm sorry. So quickly, just to give a feel to people about the spending on missile defense. So we, in my estimate, and I did some calculations, between 1983, this is in the modern history of missile defense, starting with the Star Wars program. So 1983 to 2000, we spent about $100 billion. And it's easy to see between 2000 and 2020, because most of the time the spending was about on the level of 8 to 9 billion a year. Some years was higher, some years were lower, and then it went up with Trump to now about 20 billion, and Biden is not scaling back. So the last 2 Biden budgets have the same number, about 20 billion total for missile defense. And what is the track record with that kind of money? So we spent $300 billion between 1983 and 2000, let's say 20. And so in 2009, it canceled the one of the missile defense programs called the airborne laser. And I was intimately involved with that evaluation and recommendation to cancel. But that happened much after I left the Hill. 2009, after $5 billion, a completely a fictional laser system, and I knew something about it because I had worked on high power lasers, and And then 2019, just a year and a half ago, it canceled the GMD, that is the strategic program for intercepting ICBMs from Iran and North Korea, not to mention the Russians. GMD kill vehicle, which actually the kill vehicle is the item that intercepts, physically collides with the enemy missile. And that was the Achilles heel of the program ever since it started in 1980s. And I became the whistleblower on that program, our evaluation of the technology and what happened there by Boeing. And interestingly, both these programs, the GMD interceptor that that now got canceled, and the airborne laser, both are Boeing programs. And it now they're trying to go up, get some more money to build what's called the new generation of interceptors, but it's the same contractors playing the same game. So I don't know what they're going to come up with now, except for that it'll cost a lot of money. Next slide, please. Okay, so this, you could view it when you get a chance, because the kind of small to see, but this just shows the top line as, you know, about $10 billion going along, and then higher here. But one, I just want to point out a couple of items here that you can take a look. One is the research and development funds for Israel, and the other one is the procurement fund, meaning procuring systems for the Israeli system. So the point I want to make here is, and this is a chart from CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a center-right think tank funded by the Pentagon a lot. So I went to basically the horse's mouth to get the data. And here they're clearly showing the involvement of the Israeli missile defense program totally intertwined with ours. And that, again, has a lot of political implications. But the number right now is about 20 billion total on missile defense after Trump's increase and Biden's acquiescence to that number. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here is just this picture of the GMD intercepts equation that I've been all talking about and what the problem is. And this shows the launch from East Asia, North Korea, and the different radars that are acting in the middle in terms of tracking the missile and so forth, and then intercepting with a missile that's launched from Alaska. Although I'm moving my cursor around on my screen, I know you're not seeing it because somebody else is projecting the slides. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just a couple of more points about the missile defense and congressional politics. And so historically, Democrats supported the 1972 ABM treaty, so they all opposed missile defense, and this and some Republicans too, because it was a Nixon treaty, and it went on. Even President Reagan, when he was launching this SDIO missile defense program, was not talking about abandoning the ABM treaty. They were talking about treaty compliant SDI and things of that sort. So the political pressure not to touch ABM treaty was still there in the mid 80s. And then a Clinton period, 1995, this situation changed, as I talked about before. And I just probably want to mention one thing on the congressional politics, and that is this: as the opposition wound down after the withdrawal from ABM treaty, and the Democrats and arms control community effectively accepting missile defense as a fait accompli, I remember former Congressman John Tierney from Massachusetts, who did a tremendous effort to challenge the program, holding several sessions, evening sessions on the floor of Congress with huge presentations about the problem and the fraud and the waste, because he was on the National Security Committee of the Government Affairs Committee, which is the committee that is supposed to look at the integrity of these systems and so forth. Unlike the committees of armed services where I was, and because those committees are primarily, people are on those committees to basically add money to defense budget so they can bring money to their constituencies in their home district. Okay, but Congressman Tierney deserves credit. I know he's now, of course, on Council Livable World, but I really hope that maybe we can get his attention a little bit to this issue back again. Okay, next slide, please. And so my recommendation is it's time to terminate the strategic GMD program. That's one part of the program, which is in Fort Greely and in California, is absolutely can be terminated, because the reason remains the same as it was 40 years ago, as being very harmful to strategic stability. And we now know where we find ourselves with Russia. And the system continues to suffer from fundamental technical flaws, both with the booster rocket as well as what's called the seeker in the interceptor, which is essential for homing and hitting the target. So this technology, and that's where I blew the whistle in my detailed review of the seeker technology. And Pentagon, unfortunately, has deployed tens of these interceptors in Fort Greely, in California, before proving their effectiveness, because they will never pass a rigorous test. And Russia, China, and North Korea are developing. So defense begets offense is absolutely clear. So they're developing primarily hypersonic weapons, glide weapons that could defeat these missile defense systems. In fact, Japan very smartly canceled their procurement of the Aegis Ashore system after they realized that North Korea actually has now some hypersonic capability that will be so easy to defeat the system that they put in to defend against North Korea. And President Putin once again made a reference to the defunct ABM treaty. Just the other day, I was watching, he made a press briefing after some kind of a security meeting, and his first opening statement was about the ABM treaty. So okay, I think that will be the last slide, please. Okay, yeah. So I believe also that killing the GBI, the GMD program, is a no-brainer. It's not going to do anything to anything, and people will not know that it existed ever. And a critical review of the other systems are also essential. The Aegis system, with its Standard Missile 3 interceptor, recently demonstrated a capability of shooting down an ICBM. So the Russians find this an extremely dangerous thing, because these Aegis ships are deployed in the Baltics, and they can take down Russian missiles. And so that's a big problem, red line almost, for Russia. And China also opposes the deployment of missile defense in general, but also the deployment of THAAD missiles in South Korea, which has a very powerful radar, if not the interceptor, and it is tremendously detrimental to the very limited counter missile capability in terms of a second strike capability that China retains with its arsenal of 300 or less nuclear weapons. Okay, last, I think this is the last, and one more. Okay, conclude. So again, so I want to summarize by saying that Congress must stop giving a carte blanche to missile defense. And the progressive Democrats have no reason not to oppose a nuclear arms race. And abandoning missile defense would be a powerful bargaining chip with Russia. Such a move would have no negative impact, as I was just saying, on U.S. security. And after the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM treaty, so it started also focusing on space weapons. And we must, and in our report, which I didn't have time to talk about, the space weapons is the second largest threat area in terms of threat to world peace. And ABM treaty is demise gave rise to this license to build space weapons technology, which we are building. And there were, and the final point is that Israel is cheerleading the missile defense program, as you often read about its success on Iron Dome, and recently it also demonstrated some success in Arrow. And these missile defense programs are intertwined, and they're getting a lot of money. And if you go review that spending chart, you'll see that they're getting consistently. And amazingly enough, Biden, after the last bombing of Gaza and the struggle with Hamas, Biden came out right away after the hostilities stopped that we must fulfill and give Israel $1 billion to build up its replenish its arsenal of intercepts for the Iron Dome. Where does he get these talking points? So with that, I'll stop, and we can hopefully have a good enough time for some discussion.
Thank you, Subrata. That's a great talk and extremely critical information for our movement to understand. So we thank you very much. We're going to do Q&A, and you can either put your question in the chat or you can raise your virtual hand. To raise your virtual hand, you go to your Zoom bar under reactions, and there's a thing that says raise hand. Yeva Kranowska, who's assisting tonight, is going to read the questions. And while you're getting your questions ready, I'll just take a moment to show you some of MAPPA's coming events. On Friday, we have a rally to get Elizabeth Warren to support a war powers resolution to stop the war in Yemen. That will be at the JFK Federal Building on Friday. On Saturday, Veterans for Peace has written their nuclear posture review, which is their recommendations of what the US nuclear posture should be. So they're going to present that Saturday afternoon. Monday, we'll join in a nationwide series of rallies to Afghanistan with Love on Valentine's Day, calling for the US to stop impounding the funds of the Afghan Central Bank and to take seriously the Afghan humanitarian crisis. On Monday, Harry Targ will talk about international relations and militarism today. On Tuesday, we'll talk about resisting attacks on Palestinian human rights activists. And on Wednesday of next week, Jamu Baraka will introduce the Black Alliance for Peace, human rights from an anti-war and anti-imperialist perspective. So join us for those important events. And now, Yeva, if you want to, if there's any questions you'd like to call out, you could bring them up.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll take the first one from the chat. Do you agree that Israel's Iron Dome missile defense program cannot legitimately be called defensive because it is meant to enable Israel to conduct more intense offensive action without as much worry about retaliation? Also, some experts, notably Theodore Foster of MIT, maintain that Iron Dome is fake, that it doesn't really work nearly as well as purported, except as a propaganda and a fundraising tool. Do you agree?
Well, regarding the Iron Dome being really serving offensive purpose, I think Iron Dome, in my estimate, first of all, it is being touted as the most successful missile defense program, but it's not really defending against any kind of missiles with the guidance systems, with speeds, and so forth. So, I mean, Hamas rockets are a little better than just artillery shells. So, in that regard, it's not really demonstrating anything, but the mainstream media and the Israeli media, the companies that build these systems are of course running it up the flagpole as. But of course, it does give Israel some edge, but I don't think it adds anything right now to its offensive military capability, which it has plenty. Our second question, I think I didn't quite understand. Can you repeat that?
Of course. Also, some experts, notably Theodore Postel of MIT, maintain that Iron Dome is fake, that it doesn't really work nearly as well as purported, except as a propaganda and fundraising tool. Do you agree?
Okay, so I kind of answered that. Okay, thank you.
Good. The next question is, have Russia and China eschewed missile defense programs?
Russia and China adopted, they are in principle opposed to missile defense, because in all of arms control negotiations going back to the ABM treaty and so forth, this principle was enshrined that defense means offense. And we saw that before. And so limiting missile defense for them as a strategy is something that has been successful for them. So they didn't want to go that route at all. And Russia also this time around, unlike during Reagan's buildup in the 80s, when the Russians were spending a lot of money trying to match this buildup in the US, they didn't do it this time either, because they don't have that kind of wherewithal. Russian budget, if you know, is 1/12 of the US budget. The US budget this year, the defense budget, is $778 billion. It is 40 billion more that Congress added, more than even what President Biden asked. And he asked at the same level as Trump was asking, 730 something billion dollars, and added. So Russian budget is 64 billion, maybe something like that, in the 60 billion range. So they cannot afford to join this arms race. So they took a rather different route, which is developing this very, very high-speed hypersonic weapons that are also maneuvering to defeat the missile defense systems. And they're confident they can do that. So that's where these two countries, and China is adopting the same route. Although China is modernizing its nuclear weapons arsenal and spending a lot of money doing that.
Thank you. And I'm going to call on Alfred Mayer. If you want to ask your question, go ahead. I think you're muted.
Yes, I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much for this very, very informative presentation this evening. It's very useful. My question is a historical one. It's always been my understanding that the reason that the discussions between Gorbachev and Reagan in Reykjavik promoting nuclear abolition failed was that Ronald Reagan insisted on deploying or maintaining the effort for missile defense. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously I wasn't there, but that's, I mean, my reading from what I know, exactly that Gorbachev proposed that, and Reagan initially agreed to the abolition, and then came back with this after he talked to his handlers. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And we have a question in the chat. Would the arms control trade be for the US to rejoin the ABM treaty in exchange for abandonment of hypersonic missile development by Russia and China?
Well, I think all of these are really, really possible. I mean, we have, of course, our own hypersonic program. And if you look at this year's budget in the detailed budget in the missile defense program, there's significant effort for hypersonic defense. So hypersonic defense means hypersonic offense as well. And so I think that there could be a lot on the table if we propose to eliminate the deployment, in particular, of missile defense systems on European soil that are surrounding Russia. That's an absolute red line for Russia, as much as putting in NATO soldiers or bringing Ukraine into NATO. So no, I personally believe, and my talks with Russians during my report, when we were talking to Russian experts, they are missile defense. Even there is an interview by Oliver Stone, the famous filmmaker, with Vladimir Putin, and he did a 6-hour interview that came out in a film and a book called The Putin Diaries. And there, Putin talks about missile defense all the time, and his knowledge about ABM treaty, etc. So it would be a tremendous move by Biden that he talks about de-escalation. Here is one for you that you can take.
Thank you. And I have a question from Carol Polsgrove. Would you evaluate the new Space Development Agency proposal to put a satellite swarm in a low Earth orbit to monitor hypersonic missiles? Do you know where the funding on that stands?
I'm sorry, no, I have not followed the funding. I've just read a little news clip about that, so I don't think I can add anything more than that. But it is just becoming a very dangerous to because the low Earth orbit is just getting so populated, both by commercial ventures of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others, and then on top of which we're going to be putting in all this thing. So a collision is going to happen any day if we do that, and we know the effect of the debris to everything else that we depend on the space for.
Thank you. And Sally Jones would like to know, do we have any allies in Congress to push back on missile defense?
That is the big question. I mean, we used to have many Democrats, and many have left Congress. When I was there, even a relatively conservative congressman, Congressman John Spratt from South Carolina, I worked at his office a lot, and we were working on an act called Defend America that the Republicans had introduced at that time to bring in missile defense. And so there were many Democrats who were involved. Peter DeFazio, who is still in Congress, and but many have left since. And on the Senate side, I'm sorry?
DeFazio is retiring after this term.
Oh, okay. So yeah, he was very active and is still active on many things. On the Senate side, we had Senator Kerry, we had Senator Levin, we had Senator Bumpers, and many, very many. But I think we have to cultivate. We can start with Congressman Ro Khanna. We can start with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and there are other progressive, Barbara Lee, of course, and that a discussion at least that and I would like to speak, not personally, but maybe Peace Action could speak with Congressman Tierney and get his inputs about how to make this inroads to the present situation in Congress, because these issues are completely off the radar. Why we have now a $20 billion spending on missile defense and $778 billion in defense spending.
Absolutely. And a question from Hernan. Could you please elaborate about some of the most technological and aerodynamical difficulties to put a hypersonic warhead in a faraway target?
Well, I mean, what I know, the little knowledge I have on the aerodynamics of the hypersonic systems, I think these are boost glide systems, but they're moving at this unbelievably high speed. And once they're entering the re-entry phase, they have total communication blackout, etc. So I think that it's not going to be simple do the guidance to deliver the weapon at that kind of a speed at that. So, but I'm really relatively not so knowledgeable on the aerodynamics aspects of hypersonic weapons.
Thank you. And the next question is someone calling in by phone. So if you would like to ask your question, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Sorry, missed the beginning. I didn't catch your name and affiliation.
Subrata Ghoshroy, and I'm with the MIT Science, Technology, and Society program as a research affiliate.
Okay. But you said you were in Congress?
I was. Not as a member, as a staffer.
Oh, okay. For who?
I worked for the House International Relations Committee, and the ranking Democrat was Congressman Lee Hamilton of Indiana, who is still alive.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and then Congressman Ron
Thank you.
Dellums from Berkeley.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. My real question is how is there any hope of getting back into the ABM treaty, and how would we do it?
Well, I think the main opposition to if we can just get rid of this strategic program that's based in Alaska and California, that will pave the way, because without this system, nobody else is building the systems. One thing why I'm arguing that missile defense is a low-hanging fruit, because this is not a worldwide system. It doesn't have a lot of advocates. It has mostly opposition. I mean, we have forced this down to many NATO countries' throats. NATO initially did not want missile defense system. So the support is very minimal. So if we do get rid of this program, which is also very wasteful, technically not possible, then I think one can talk about a revival of the a limited ABM treaty. But my fear is the space lobby, space weapons lobby is so strong, and the Pentagon is now has so many of these people that were reinstalled during the Trump administration that I think we'll have a huge pushback if we want to bring back the ABM treaty the old way. But some limited form of ABM, I think, is possible, and we should talk about it.
Yeah. Did you said that we withdrew from the ABM treaty under the Clinton administration or under Bush?
Bush, 2002.
Oh, okay. One other question, quick. Are there any people within the military who we could contact and meet halfway, or who would come out against it? I remember 20 years ago, Colonel Robert Bowman was in charge of the predecessor to the Star Wars program. When Reagan came aboard, went full steam ahead when Reagan came on board and went full speed ahead with it, he resigned and then started speaking out against it. He wrote a book. He's no longer in the speaker's circus. He's getting old and he's not in good health. But his book is available if you can find it. It's called Star Wars: Salvation or Death Star. It's Colonel Robert Bowman.
Yeah, no, I don't, right now, I mean, since I've been out of Washington for so long that I don't have an understanding of who at the Pentagon can be tapped or find some sympathetic ear there. Because right now it's just, they're having such a great time with this kind of money. And so opposition is not there really, at least visibly.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps we have time for maybe one more question from William Burns in the chat. Would you also comment on our new nuclear arms race? This budget adds $28 billion to our budget for this year only. Where does this head year after year?
Yeah, well, I mean, the program is supposedly this $1 trillion program, the 30-year program. So that was done during the Obama years. and Obama did that to get his arms control treaty, so to speak. So the money is there year after year. And that's a good point because, we have so much debate about Biden's Build Back Better funding. So we're talking about a $2 trillion or $3 trillion funding. Now, nobody says that this $2 or $3 trillion is not a single year funding. It's a 10-year funding. So we are really talking about 200 billion or 300 billion a year for Build Back Better. And how much are we spending on nuclear weapons and the Pentagon for the 10-year period? I mean, Pentagon is almost 800 billion a year. So it'll be 8 trillion versus a $2 trillion Build Back Better program. Why aren't these comparisons made and discussed when people are opposing the Build Back Better plan?
Yes, definitely. And I have a similar question from Sally Jones. Is the US going to be spending even more on missile defense in order to counter hypersonic missiles?
Well, I mean, obviously, the road to higher spending on missile defense is already here. I mean, we went up from 10 billion to 20 billion just in a span of a couple of years. And now they have put in the Hypersonics program, and I haven't looked at what's called the FYDP, which is the Future Years Defense Program budget, meaning the 5-year projections on hypersonics, because that's the way for the Pentagon to really stabilize the program funding, saying we're putting in this future years. So I would imagine the hypersonics is still very much in an R&D kind of phase. So the money is relatively small. And as soon as you can see is that it can be going to the higher levels in R&D, like a system development, we will see billions pouring in. So yeah, I think they will find no problem in building up a hypersonics program by hyping the North Korean threat or Russian threat.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the questions, and thank you for everyone who sent one into the chat. I'm going to pass it back to Cole so he can close up.
Thank you, Yeva, and thank you, Subrata, for an outstanding presentation. This is such an underappreciated issue, and it is important that we get some momentum going to raise it and challenge it. If anyone here would be interested in working to form an action group to address this issue, please be in touch. We're going to follow up tonight's program with an email. The full report of the International Working Group Moving Beyond Missile Defense and Space Weapons is available. We have some hard copies, and it's also available online. So we're going to send out an email with that resource and with the video of tonight's presentation. And Subrata, if you wish to make your slides available, a couple of people in the chat were asking for them. So that's up to
yes, I would definitely do that. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Cole, for giving me this opportunity. And if there is any group formed, I would be happy to work with them. And especially the outreach to Congress, I think would be very important. And I enjoyed very much this evening.
Okay, Charles Johnson from IPP&W wants to join the working group, so we got a member. All right. So everyone be in touch. Thank you for your attention, and please continue your good work for peace. Bye, everyone.
Yeva, thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.